Welcome everyone to this Vine font pack walkthrough. The pack contains models that are in the OBJ format, which means they can be used in just about any 3D application. But this pack contains presets for Element 3D, which is a After Effects plugin, and Cinema 4D, which is a standalone application, but also comes packaged with After Effects as a light version. And for demonstration purposes, I'm going to be using Element 3D. So here we are in After Effects. I already have Element applied to a layer. Let's get into Element and have a look. So once you've installed the pack, you'll find it in your Models browser. The pack contains a thick set and a thin set of alpha-numerics, a foliage folder, and textures. So let's start off with looking at the difference between the thin set and the thick set. I already have add to group checkbox checked. So let's grab a thin and a thick model. So here is basically the difference. The thin models do not intersect. They come already with a texture applied. The thick model does intersect, but in a way that you would probably find in nature. With the vine itself kind of presses in against itself. And I really like the look of that. So that's basically the difference. Next, let's have a look at the textures. There's several textures here, several vine textures. Some other types of metallic textures. Cable. And a more organic texture there. These cones are textures for the Thorn model, and we'll get into that. And the reason why the textures are here in the model browser is that it just makes it easier to find everything that you need in one place. And the way you apply these is you simply add these to your scene. They'll be introduced to your scene as a 3D model. You can simply delete these. But the textures themselves then still remain in your scene file. So the texture that you have applied already is Vine 4. The textures are 2K resolution and seamless. So seeing as how Vine 4 is already applied, let's just have a quick look at that. Ideally, when you apply a texture, you first want to go to the X coordinate and adjust it to the look that you want to create. For instance, this may seem a little bit too crushed, too crowded. So take it down to the level that you want to get the look that you want. Let's have a look at Vine 1. A more wooden look. Maybe too crowded again. It's not too bad. Vine 2. Vine 3. Vine 3 is interesting. It has lichen and blemishes. Adds a bit of character. Again, adjust the X coordinate to get the look that you want. Vine 4 was the original. Vine 5 is interesting as well. Has these stress marks that follow the length of the model. Okay, so that's the vine textures. So let's have a look at some of the other textures. Delete them so that they're in my scene file and not obscuring my view. And now I can add them and check them out. So, although the pack is designed around the vine concept with flowers and thorns, I just wanted to add some other textures that would indicate that you can use these for any other purpose, not just as a vine. So again, wrong one. Now I have a tube. Cable. And what I've called blood and guts. Just to show that there are other uses for these models other than vine. Anything that is vine-like, tube-like, cable-like, you can use these models to get that effect. Okay, next we'll have a look at the foliage folder. The foliage folder is a collection of leaves, flowers, and a thorn. These are designed to be used as particles. Most 3D applications can use models or geometry as a base to then populate along its surface or within its volume a set of particles. Those particles can be anything, they can be other geometry, and both Cinema 4D and Element 3D have a way of doing this. This pack contains high poly and low poly of each model. What that means is that the low poly model is a 2D surface. The high poly model has 3D volume. Rendering these can be CPU and GPU intensive, so you can manage your scene depending on how close the camera is. The high poly objects have a definable edge because they have volume, but apart from that, the texture and shape is identical. So I've saved them in this position because they apply better as a particle. There's the high poly ivy leaf. It has thickness, has volume, whereas the other one is simply a 2D plane. But effectively they're identical. Now in most 3D applications, it is important where the origin of the model is, but not in Element. Element only cares about where it is in the 3D world. So it's important that these models are in the center of 3D space in this viewport. And whatever models you add as particle objects must be in center of the world space. Because this point here is where it's going to connect along the surface of the replicator object. Okay, so let's have a look at some of these other models. So we have two sets of the ivy leaf. Get rid of those. They are all actual models. They're not planes with transparent textures. And the reason for that is that in Element and other applications, actual geometry is more reliable when it comes to ambient occlusion and shadows rather than textures that have transparency and the leaf is just a plane. Now you can get some really nice results with transparent textures that really show the edges of things really nicely, but particularly in Element, it doesn't play well with ambient occlusion and shadows. We have two sets of another leaf. The other set is very similar. put the low poly in. Alt click will give you the selection under your mouse. This leaf was used in the promo, both the high poly and low poly. We have 2 roses. These are the low poly versions. These models can be render intensive. And a thorn. I found that this shape was more reliable and lent itself well for being used as a particle. You can change its length to make it sharper, longer. You can subtly change its width. But generally speaking, having a model that is the same from any angle lends itself really well as a particle. Okay, so let's have a look at how to put all this together. So we want a base model. Let's go to our alphabet. We'll choose the letter A. And let's just say we're happy with the texture. Now, Element requires us to do a couple of things here. First of all, we need to duplicate the model. Now, Element will only render one of these objects. The other object, which won't be renderable, Element will use as its base mesh to duplicate the particles. So one of these we'll put on group 2. The other, for Element to understand this object's 3D space correctly, it needs to be put in a folder. So we'll just rename that. And under this group drop-down box, at the end you'll see this little checkbox. At the moment it's set to renderable mode, but we don't want that. We want it set to replicator mode. Okay, so let's add some foliage. We'll add a leaf and a thorn. And these are rotated and positioned so that they will populate along the surface of the base mesh in a more natural way. Let's click OK. The leaf has subsurface scattering applied, but that is too strong. So let's just take that down to, say, 5%. At the moment, both letters are being rendered. The leaf is rendered by itself down here. And Element is only choosing at the moment to render that one leaf. The thorn is still there. But we need to let Element know here what's going on and what we expect. So group 2 is fine. We don't need to touch that. Group 1 is replicating the letter A as a point object. It's not taking this other object into consideration. So we need to tell it that we are using this as a 3D object. Now Element knows to use the letter A as a 3D object, as a base mesh, and it is populating it with those particles, the leaves and the thorns. The leaves are too big. So normally you would come down and just change the particle size. But when we do that, it highlights another problem. All the particles are being scaled uniformly, both the leaf and the thorn, which means you don't really have control over that. If I was to change the rotation of these, it would change the rotation of the leaves and the thorns together. If I wanted to animate the leaves as though they were blowing in a slight breeze, for example, I couldn't do that without also animating the thorns, which I don't want. Thankfully, Element has a workaround. We'll just reset that scale and go back into the scene setup. These objects, in order to have individual control over them, need to be put into their own auxiliary channels. So we'll put the leaf in channel 1 and the thorn in channel 2 and hit OK. Nothing should change, but now we have control over both of these. So we'll close up particle look. We'll close up particle replicator, and we'll just dial down and drill down into the channels. So let's have a look at the leaves first. They're too big, so we just need to scale these down. We may want to just change their rotation a little bit so they droop down. Something like that. Now the thorns are too big, and they're on group 2. And they should all be sitting roughly where you need them to be. You can change the orientation of these as well, just to suit your needs. But for the most part, they should all be sitting along the surface, orientated in a way that looks fairly natural, without too much work. Now, of course, the downside with this approach is that these particles are not aware of each other, and so they will intersect. But you can change the seed value of these objects to get the look that you want for the camera angle that you're using. But in a very short space of time, you have a basic setup where now you have a letter that is a vine that you can use in your animation. So let's go back into Element and have a look at how we need to approach a situation where we want to have a word instead of just one single letter. And Element treats this a little bit differently. So we're back in scene setup and we want to create a word. So we'll just turn off the visibility of the thorn and leaf for the moment. We'll add a folder and we'll check add to group, and let's add some letters. Helps to be in front view. Okay. So let's just say we're happy with the textures, we're happy with the placement, we're happy with the design. Let's just put that on group 5 for the moment. Now, you would think that with all these objects in a folder, that Element would treat this folder as a single object, but it doesn't. It treats these objects as individual objects and as a list. So if we were to apply the leaves and thorns to it, it would apply them consecutively, not concurrently, meaning if you had 50% coverage, it would cover 50% of the objects, which is the I and the C. It wouldn't cover the O or the M. So how does Element handle this? Well, we're happy with our design. We go back into After Effects. We don't worry about what's appearing here at the moment. We drill down to Utilities. Our icon object is on group 5 and we want to export it as an OBJ. Click Generate. Element will ask you what folder you want to save it to. As you can see, I've already done this. And then a name. So let's just name this. And click Save. It'll go ahead and generate that as a single object. And we can close that up and head back into Scene Setup. So we don't need this folder anymore, but we may want to keep it as a backup. You can turn off Add to Group. And now we need to import that object again. Now you'll be presented with an OBJ file and an E3D file. We need to import the E3D file. Just double click on it. And it'll come into our scene. A very important step is to hit Normalize Size. We have our model. All the textures are in place. We can go ahead and duplicate that. Put one of these on group 2. Group 1 again. We don't need to add this to a folder this time. We need to change this to replicator mode. Change the visibility of the thorn and the leaf. Click OK. And there you have it. The thorns and leaves are distributed over the surface of the model. And then you can adjust the orientation and animation of the objects as you see fit. So let's just go back into Scene Setup. Now at the moment we have one leaf and one thorn. What that means is that there will be 50-50 split between these two objects. If, for example, we want double the amount or at least a third more leaves than there are thorns, then we simply add another leaf. To this setup. And what I like to do is to go into the material settings, click duplicate and replace. That way I'm dealing with just this particular instance of the textures. And I might desaturate it a little bit, both on the diffuse and in the reflection channel. And hit OK. And I forgot to put that on auxiliary channel. one. So now I'm going to have more leaves than there are thorns, but still only covering 3% of the surface of the model. Well, that was a brief walkthrough of the Vine font pack. I hope that helped. My name is Martin Staley. Thanks for watching.